the amount of times I've been, and just for a brief moment, you almost sort of lose track and forget and you're looking at this like marvel on a really good migration day, and the number of birds that'll be coming through, and it's absolutely incredible. And then the next thing you know is all of a sudden you'll hear the gunshots start.
Welcome to Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith. I'm here with Lloyd Scott from the Committee Against Bird Slaughter. I think one of the most important conservation charities, and certainly one of the bravest in all of Europe. It's just mind-boggling the number of migrating birds that get massacred by hunters, often for no reason whatsoever, just vanity or sport, particularly around the Mediterranean basin, as they make their way north and south each spring and then each autumn. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen those hunters lined up in Malta. I just couldn't believe it. These puff of smoke and a bang coming from this place and that place. And you wonder how any birds actually manage to make it back from their wintering grounds in Africa back to Europe. It's ecocide on a massive scale. And the Committee Against Bird Slaughter is using a whole bunch of brilliant and hands-on techniques to try and bring this to an end. Lloyd, you're an ecologist, and I always remember that wonderful quote by Aldo Leopold, that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that you live alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen. And I guess that's never more true when it comes to the massacre of migrating birds. Most people just don't know. They hear different birds singing in their back gardens and in their parks and in the countryside in summer. And then those birds disappear off on their annual migration in autumn. And nobody realizes the extent of the gauntlet that they have to run, and also just how depleted their numbers are by this activity. Can you give me a sense of how big a problem is this?
No, absolutely. So people quite often say, why is it that you focus your efforts in the Mediterranean? Why isn't it stuff that you're dealing with here back home? And it's essentially, I always refer to it as like the three pillars of bird migration. So there's the three geographical flyways that birds will take: the Western flyway through Spain and Iberia through to Morocco, the Central flyway through Italy, Malta, as you mentioned, into Tunisia, and then in Eastern Europe as well. So where there's these bottlenecks of migration each spring and autumn, that's where we focus our bird protection camps. So basically where there's a deep-rooted tradition of legal hunting, and then obviously that then falls into methods of poaching as well. So, for example, each year we conduct around 30 bird protection camps along these three main migratory flyways. So in Spain, we've had a campaign against what's called passerines, which are illegal lime stick trapping installations against thrushes. So just as an example, when they were first outlawed in 2001, there was around 5,000 licensed each year. In the last autumn campaign, I think our teams documented just around 50 remaining. In Italy, we've had a long-standing campaign against these traditional songbird traps called bow traps, archetti. When the teams first started there back in the 80s, they'd be collecting each autumn season around 5,000-6,000 just in a couple of weeks. I think the peak year was in 2001, and the teams collected more than 12,000 traps. Last autumn, it was down to just 400 bow traps. So again, that's another success. In Cyprus, basically, although bird trapping is illegal all throughout the year, especially outside of the licensed hunting season, the penalties are much higher. So this has enabled us in spring. Now we've essentially, the last 2-3 seasons, we've found that it's almost just non-existent. And where we have caught trappers, and the penalties that have been imposed are up to €10,000. So that's enabled us to free up some resources to now start sending teams to some of the Greek islands, where there's a big issue of turtle dove and bee-eater oriole hunting, that kind of thing. So we've got more teams there. And in Lebanon, I mentioned some of the guys that we have with us. They're former hunters. They've now actually formed an anti-poaching unit, which are actually also involved in training some of the security forces. And they're also now doing regular training seminars with the local police, doing stuff in schools as well. So there's a big education initiative which is ongoing, which is really positive to where we were at just even like 5 years ago.
And I saw one report from CABS that showed you'd analysed the Facebook and other social media posts of the hunters. And it seems like a lot of these hunters, they're not killing these birds for food, and often not even just for fun, but they're doing it to create a kind of trophy. So I saw some images of Lebanese or Maltese or Cypriots who'd rented or owned a bling kind of Range Rover with a big shiny black bonnet. And then they'd line up all the birds that they'd killed either in front of or on top of the bonnet of this bling car. And by analysing those trophy posts, you could deduce the number of birds that were being killed by a different route. And the numbers, again, were just staggering.
That's right. That was an article that we had published in Oryx, and it was specifically looking at Lebanese hunters mainly. It's a huge thing over there. It's quite showy in the culture. It's a very macho gun culture thing going on there. And we collected, I think it was like 13,000 images from Facebook, Instagram, other social media, just to look at the range of species that were being affected. I think it was 152 species we recorded. And things like lesser spotted eagles, white storks, orioles, nightjars, you name it. And like you say, it's certainly not been done for survival. It's not been done for anything other than just to sort of show, hey, look. And then literally they'll take the image, discard the birds. That's the whole point.
It feels almost kind of godless. Like it's just to not have any kind of sense of the sacred of these birds. Imagine a golden oriole, or what about the flock of pink flamingos that flew over Malta 3 days before I got there? And I was told that of 20 flamingos that landed exhausted from their long journey onto the island, only 3 made it off alive. Like, who shoots pink flamingos? So what is the psychology here? Is this pure sport, or does this go back to a time in which migrating birds were some kind of a food bounty? Because certainly Malta feels like a place that is pretty deprived, or would have been pretty deprived. It's a rock in the middle of the Mediterranean, probably hard to grow crops there. And you sort of imagine that this must have been a great bounty every autumn and every spring when the migrating birds came through. But suddenly there are 30, 40,000 guys with guns, not to mention glue traps. And I want to talk about some of the technologies they're using to kill these birds. And the birds don't stand a chance. But do you think it's rooted in some kind of seasonal bounty?
Yeah, for sure. In a lot of these areas, it's regarded as either seasonal delicacy. And then just from a macho gun culture, I don't know that these guys, just to be honest, they have such miserable lives at home that they just want to go sit in a pile of rocks to get away from home. And yeah, they're literally, like you say, there's the seasonal bounty of birds passing through, that they're just taking aim at anything and everything. The amount of times I've been, and just for a brief moment, you almost sort of lose track and forget and you're looking at this like marvel on a really good migration day, and the number of birds that'll be coming through, and it's absolutely incredible. And then the next thing you know is all of a sudden you'll hear the gunshots start. And then it's like, all right, okay, right, record film. And they're just taking aim at anything and everything. And it's almost like a sort of frenzy. You'll hear, sometimes you can almost track the bird's movement through, say, a valley. This happens quite often in Malta. You're just following the noise of gunshots until then it stops and you know the bird's down.
It's just a horror show. And what impact do you think this is having on bird populations? Because obviously there'd be some natural attrition on a big migration, birds that don't make it because they're predated or the journey's too arduous or what have you. But 75 million odd birds being killed by sports hunters around the Mediterranean basin during the course of a year, which is 2 migrations, that must be having a pretty big impact. Like I stood there in Malta, which is the main flyway route for birds going up into Italy and Central Europe. And I wondered, how do any birds make it? How do they hear nightingales at all in the Apennines? You know, how do any make it through? But that might be an exaggeration. I don't know. What impact do you think it's having on European bird numbers, which are already obviously under pressure because of modern farming practices and pesticides and the insect apocalypse and all the other things that are going wrong in their natural habitats? How big is this?
Oh, it's such a vast subject applying to so many different species. It's really difficult to sort of summarise, to be honest. And like you say, of course, industrial farming practices, climate change, these are always the sort of go-to main factors driving declines. For sure, without doubt, hunting is having such an enormous and significant impact on so many different species. An obvious one to come to that tosses the line between legal and illegal hunting is turtle dove. I think estimates are that the European breeding population is around 5 million breeding pairs. And again, referring back to the hunting bag statistics paper we did, when we were looking at the bag stats just for Spain alone, that was near on 1 million birds being taken. And that's the ones that are being reported. In Italy, there was poor statistics we had for there. That was around 100,000 birds. So you just top this up over, say, 10 countries that were allowing hunting. The impact on the entire breeding population is enormous, is absolutely enormous. And again, this is the figures that we can actually collate and report. That's only the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority are not documented. It's what we see.
I know that CABS is an on-the-ground charity. So it's an organisation of volunteers and staff who get out there. You go to Lebanon each year. I mean, I want to talk about that and your experiences there and your courage going to a place where everyone's a gun toter and there's a war not far away. But before we get to that, I just want to talk about advocacy efforts, because another thing that CABS does is work with governments in the Mediterranean to encourage them to adopt better protections against the slaughter of migrating birds. And it seems to me that in the west of Europe, in France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, for example, perhaps Greece, there's been some success and some rays of light in recent years as a result of your efforts and those of other NGOs. Can we talk a little bit about that? To what extent governments anywhere are listening to what you've got to say? This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
Yeah, so quite often in a lot of these places. So, of course, like bird trapping, for example, just is entirely illegal under the Birds Directive. So what it is these member states, quite often under the guise of preserving tradition, they'll allow derogations, so loopholes to the law, under the justification of preserving tradition. So like in France, there was the use of stone crush traps in the Central Massif, lime sticks in Provence, lapwing trapping on the Atlantic coast, horsehair snares, the list goes on. And quite often what we've done is when we send teams on the ground, we prove the scale to which these traps are non-selective, how cruel they are, the range of species being affected. And we use that as a lobby and sort of campaign tool to work with local partners to push the EU, which it's extremely bureaucratic and long-winded, to get any change. But yeah, we use that to then push and obviously just raise awareness with the public as well, who are quite often aren't even aware that this is going on.
I mean, I literally can't bear to look at it when I see posts that you and other organisations put up of birds stuck by their feet on these lime sticks or caught up with snares and traps of various kinds. And these are little songbirds, birds that I'm delighted to see when they come back to my garden in England. And I just can't bear to look at it. How big a problem is that as compared with the guns? Because I'd always imagined that the vast bulk of these 75 odd million birds, number we're of course guessing, it could be even more, that are being slaughtered each year are being shot out the sky. But so how big is trapping, legal or illegal?
to sort of scale one against the other, to be honest, is quite difficult. But for sure, just as an example, say with some of the campaign work we do against hunters in, say, Cyprus or Lebanon, immediately what will happen is, hey, why are you picking on us? We're the good guys. I'm a good hunter. You're there with your supermarket chicken and all the rest of it. Don't pick on me. Or it's the trappers that are causing the real big problem, where they'll be using electronic decoys to lure birds, and they're, in some cases where it's organised gangs doing it, they're easily taking in excess of 1,000 birds a night. So trapping, it sort of goes from in some cases where you've sort of got the old boy setting a few lime sticks in an olive orchard to harvest a few warblers to supplement the sort of food, to them where, like I say, they start using electronic decoys, to them where they're using mist nets, and it just becomes more organised, more industrial, to examples, like I say, where we've got cases where there's huge amounts of money being made and they're taking literally thousands of birds per night during sort of peak migration season.
And the money's being made because these birds are for cages, for singing. You walk in some of these Spanish towns, for example, and you see little cages hanging outside the doors of people's homes, and especially in Menorca and various other places, and you see their goldfinches, greenfinches. So is the money being made because of that?
Different motivations in different places. I would say the western and central flyways, it's more often than not this obsession with, catching birds to collect them, to put them in cages, to put them in singing contests, to almost like trade them as if they're like some sort of feathered Pokemons. For sure, in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's a lot more driven by catching songbirds for the restaurant trade. They're classed as seasonal delicacies.
So are governments listening then? You mentioned that these loopholes in some places are starting to have a greater spotlight shone on them because of your work. And of course, they banned in France, Spain, Italy, they banned the shooting of turtle doves altogether, and obviously the trapping of them for a couple of years. And during that time, the turtle dove population increased dramatically. And we even noticed it here in Britain that more turtle doves started coming back. And now, of course, they've reopened the hunting season because the species is no longer at complete rock bottom. So are they listening, governments, to your work?
I would hope so. But then, like you say, there's such an enormous pressure from the hunting lobby. And of course, then, we talk about this, like you say, it's a bounce back from nothing. There were reported figures, even by some other NGOs, was that they'd recovered by 25% in that 4 year. But 25% of what? It's not 25% of the historical number, going back 25 years. So it was only a minuscule increase in the population. Like we say, we were starting to see birds arriving here again. And then that's justification. Right, okay, so the trends sort of change, so then they'd open up the hunting season again. So they'll listen for a time, and then when there's a big media spotlight on it, there seems to be action. So like in terms of calling for the police to take action. But then the truth is, as soon as we're away again, then of course it goes back to normal.
And so much of it is legal anyway. So what do you do personally, Lloyd, when you go off to Lebanon during the migrating seasons in spring and autumn? How is your time spent, and what are you doing each day? So we basically we recruit a team of volunteers, and we work with local partners, other NGOs there on the ground. So what we do is we'll go over there. We've got a really good team of guys that are on the ground year round there as well. And during peak migration, we go out and we'll go to some of the main migratory bottleneck areas up in the mountains, the mountain passes. We're checking the sort of coastal plains as well. Just basically looking for areas where we know, again, if we're going out and we're monitoring illegal hunting, we'll be going to key mountain passes that we've mapped out, and we're literally doing field surveillance on hunters, and we'll get evidence on them shooting down raptors. As soon as we've got that evidence, we'll report it to the police, bring the police in. And then likewise with trapping, we go and find active trapping sites, get as much evidence as we can, call the police in, and then we work with local Lebanese partners as well. Isn't it dangerous, Lloyd? I mean, Lebanon's a dangerous place anyway. These are hunters, armed people in a country that's known to be quite lawless. So what's the danger to you? Have you ever been physically threatened?
Obviously, it happens quite a lot. 9 times out of 10, of course, a lot of these guys know exactly what they're doing is illegal. Quite often, they've probably got links to other kinds of crime as well. So normally, as soon as that they know that they're being filmed or they know that the police are on the way, in the bulk of incidents, that they'll just hot tail it and they immediately leave the area. We have had confrontations, and likewise the team in Cyprus as well. It can be very hostile there if they think that we're sort of potentially impeding on their livelihood. So especially with trapping, I would say that's normally where there's more of a confrontation because there's a financial incentive linked into it. With the shooting, normally as soon as they know that they're being filmed, they'll just pack up and immediately leave the area. So they don't want to be caught.
I mean, I was shown around one particularly active hunting ground in Malta by a group of female rangers, and they told me that these hunters can get incredibly aggressive and often quite violent. And there've even been killings of journalists that have been linked to exposing, if not the hunting, then the other crime that's being perpetuated by the same people. Because as you say, it's often gangsters who are involved in drug running and other things who are at the core of the hunting fraternity. So it seems to me that you guys are all incredibly brave to be doing this. I've also involved through the Cyprus Environment Foundation, which is part of the Conservation Collective, which I chair. Again, it's pretty tough work getting out there in Cyprus and identifying what's going on and documenting it without getting physically threatened by some quite scary people.
Yeah, it can be extremely intimidated, and more often than not, they'll immediately go to the, why are you filming? What we're doing is legal. You're disturbing us, or it's immediately going for you're trespassing on private property. Of course, we don't break the law. We toe the line, and we're trying to do kind of the job that the police should be doing. And obviously, we're acting as civilians, so we'll always, if it is in a private compound, we'll try and do it where we can film from a public area. And yeah, when we bring the police in, we'll always try and work out where the sort of main entry and exit points are to a certain area. But yeah, there are confrontations with it. Of course, we try and not antagonise it any further than it's just sort of comes with the nature of the job. A lot of the areas where I work as well, quite often we will have local support there as well. So that also helps with sort of de-escalation. It's not just Johnny Foreigner coming over and telling us what we can do.
Do we have a sense of what proportion of the general public in these countries feels as outraged as we do about the hunting? Because there was a referendum on spring hunting in Malta, and it sort of, I think it fell just on the side of the hunters. So just a little bit less than 50% of voters opted for a ban on spring hunting, which seems extraordinary to me. But then I was told that the Maltese voting population is about 500,000 people. And so when you take into account the 40,000 hunters and then all their family members and their immediate associates, you end up with quite a large proportion of the population. But that might be somewhat unique, because I bet if you ran polls in Spain or Italy or Greece, I bet you'd find that the overwhelming majority of people are revolted by this activity.
Yeah, for sure. And especially younger generations, like I said before, quite often it's always linked into the sort of more traditionalist mindset. And yeah, older generations that are especially sort of linked into the sort of, hunting and trapping tradition. And also, in a lot of these places, it has an enormous impact on people that are linked with the tourist industry. You don't want to have, where you run in hotels, you don't want to have guys just immediately running around shooting birds. I can remember actually one of the first times when I went to Cyprus as being at the hotel that we were using as a base camp, and there were being some other British tourists nearby, and they were going, "Wow, that's incredible! Can you hear all the bird call?" And they were just listening to decoy callers, not realising what it was. Sorry, back to your question though. Yeah, I think younger generations and the vast majority of people, of course, they find it completely abhorrent. And they are against it. And they're also very supportive of our work as well.
And what about the generational differences? Because I certainly, when you get other kinds of wildlife crime, when you get wolves being poisoned or shot in northern Spain or Italy, and the heads kind of nailed to the national park billboards and so on, and whenever there's a prosecution, it's always some angry old git, in their 70s or 80s, and it's not very often a young person. And I wonder, therefore, is it optimistic to expect that younger people in these Mediterranean basin countries are less interested in slaughtering migratory songbirds than older guys? Or do you think it's all ages and that's a fantasy?
It's difficult to answer. I think there seems to be more progress, for sure, in the west and the central flyways. There seems to be a faster change there. I think to what the situation was like, for example, in Malta, the first time I went to Malta was in 2012, to what it's like now. For sure, the illegal hunting, and I'm sure my colleagues would support me in this, there's been a really positive change from the hunting side. Trapping remains extremely deep-rooted. And then there's still these derogations, like they still allow this, the finch trapping. But for sure, the hunting, there's definitely been a change in the right direction. And I think that's as well, because especially in Malta, I would say that there are more eyes per capita now watching the situation. There's a real spotlight on the situation there. And I think it's a good example of where this kind of work works. In the Eastern Med, if I'm honest, I think that, we're talking, for sure, it's going to see me to retirement. And there's still this thing, like you mentioned before, that's almost like the days of, the social media age, this sort of showy aspect to it. Just to go back to a point that you mentioned before, though, about almost like youth engagement. One thing that I have noted, especially in Lebanon, sometimes we even have cases where you've even got kids, and when you'll say, okay, can we see what you've taken this morning? And they'll present us with a carrier bag full of dead birds. And you look in there and they say, no, I'm a good hunter. I'm a good hunter. I won't shoot the big birds. I'm just shooting the small birds. He said, okay, right, let's see what you've shot. And you'll look in a carrier bag full of 30, 40 dead birds. And you're saying, this is protected. And then quite often they'll say that all it was is that they want to, sometimes they're not even shooting them to eat. They want to see them up close. And then they'll discard them. And then when you actually talk about the bird and you talk about the journey, or say, we've had it with kestrels, and these kids in northern Lebanon, and they'd even slit the bird's throat and then discarded it. And you say, why have you done that? We just wanted to see it. It's beautiful. And it's like they're admiring its beauty, yet at the same time destroying it and then throwing it away. And then when you talk about the bird's journey, where it's come from, what it does, how it can help, these things kill the rats and rodents and the locusts that sometimes will be, affecting the farms. And I'd never thought of it like that. This is why it's protected. You need to protect it. And then it's sort of okay. So a lot of it, I would say, doesn't necessarily always come from like a malicious intent. There's also, it's selfish, but it's this thing of wanting to see it up close and understand it. And without that sort of education, they don't know that. So without people even sort of saying, this is what the value of these birds means, or even understanding the journey some of these birds have undertaken. And then when they get that and they know that, sorry, it's a bit of a tangent, but yeah, some of the people we work with in Lebanon, they are, they used to be hunters. And it's that classic sort of, they've gone from being hunters, good hunters. I'm a good hunter, don't shoot big birds, shoot small birds, but then understanding the value of these species. Now, although they'd still say they're hunters, they'll hunt with a camera. They hunt with us to go looking for the guy shooting eagles.
It certainly seems to be deep-rooted tradition combined with this social media phenomenon of wanting to seem like the macho guy who killed as many orioles as possible on the day and had them lined up for a photograph. Our Malta Environment Foundation, again, part of the Conservation Collective, is trying to accelerate this generational shift in attitudes. And one of the things we've done is we've supported BirdLife Malta, which has established a bird hospital. And the bird hospital receives from members of the public injured birds that have been shot or found in traps, still alive but injured. And it nurses them back to health and then releases them into the wild, but with a lot of social media around it and a lot of involvement from local school kids. So then you get a bunch of 12-year-olds releasing an injured stork or flamingo or raptor back into the air, and off it goes. And then it's on the evening news, or it's on TikTok and Instagram and so on. And it's a way of without directly coming up against the hunting fraternity, which is very frightening for a lot of Maltese to do. It's a way of winning over hearts and minds, especially among the young, and highlighting the horror of this practice, which I think is an interesting thing. I think the generational transition in attitudes is possibly the greatest hope here. What about technology, Lloyd? And what about drones? They're so cheap and so effective, drones now. And I know that a lot of the African parks and so on are using them to protect wildlife against poaching. Couldn't cabs unleash swarms of monitoring drones during migration season to hover above the hunters and film them and so on? Because it seems to me that technology could be a game changer.
That's true, but then there's also the sort of cost implications with it. And the first time we released a drone in Malta, it caused a real storm, shall we say. But yeah, they'll shoot them down. It's not so bad for doing trapping surveys. But yeah, it's not really something that we have used in hunting against illegal shooting so much. More often than not, it's confirming whether trapping sites are active. So the clap nets in Malta and mist net trapping sites in Cyprus.
I just admire what you guys do so much. This is one of the great wildlife and environment crimes that's taking place year in, year out in Europe. One of the biggest, and it's a one that we directly feel the impacts of here in Britain because fewer birds are able to survive the migration and get back here. And it's just so important that we get on top of this, and no one's really working so fully on this as Committee Against Bird Slaughter. It's you guys are out there in the field, you're out there talking to politicians and governments and hunters and really taking the fight to this issue. And I'm so grateful for what you do, Lloyd. And I'm really grateful to you for joining this podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And I'd love to stay in touch with you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I really am in awe of the bravery and the determination of Lloyd and the other team members at the Committee Against Bird Slaughter. They're making a genuine difference in a bunch of places. I urge you to follow their work and consider supporting them. I hope you're enjoying this current series of Rewilding the World. I'd be very grateful if you'd give us a review or a like on whatever platform you use to get your podcast. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Rewilding the World, where we show some of the best snippets from these episodes. In the next episode, I'm going to be talking about the campaign to reintroduce mountain lions, or cougars or panthers, or as they were once known in eastern North America, catamounts, to the eastern side of America, where they've been absent for about 150 years. Cougars are a vital part of the ecosystem, and working to bring them back are Renee Secor and the Bring Catamounts Home campaign, supported by Emily Carollo from the Cougar Research Council and other NGOs.